out a Foot Clan! Let's go! Forge Gang! I am still a hard man! Let's go! All right. Because of Wi-Fi issues, I did a stream about this about 20 minutes ago. Because of interruptions, I had to just quit. So I'm doing this again. This is life in the Germanic barbarian kingdoms that replaced the Western Roman Empire. So I guess in a way, you could say that the origins of Europe, what came to be known as Europe, Western civilization, sort of had a start in classical Greece and Rome. And there's even people that say that it goes back to pharaonic Egypt and to Mesopotamia. And in a way, I guess you could say that's true. However, because of the Middle Ages that happened from 476 to 1453 AD, a lot of that classical culture, in fact, most of it was lost. Medieval culture was very radically different. It was, in fact, it had a lot more in common with barbarian cultures in Northern Europe than it did with the Mediterranean. In fact, medieval culture is a mixture of Latin and Germanic customs and stuff that over time, over a very long period of time, became the medieval core of Europe. Now, Scandinavia, Hungary, the Finno-Ugric tribes of the Northeast, the Baltic peoples, and basically all the Slavs, a lot of those people were outside the pale of Christendom. It was actually not until much later, sometimes well after 1000 AD, that these people were gradually brought into Christendom. So the foundations of Christendom only became possible once the classical world was extirpated. In a way, the Roman Empire of Theodosius the Great sort of was an early form of Christendom. But Christendom only has its start with Emperor Charlemagne, when Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, was crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800 AD with the Pope. The Pope crowned him the Emperor of the Romans. And by then, it was a very radically different title from what it was under the Roman Empire, and even considerably different from what the Eastern Romans, more famously known as the Byzantines, would have had. But regardless, European identity, I don't think, began with either the Greeks or the Romans. The Greeks, Romans, Phoenicians, Persians, Carthaginians, Etruscans, all of these people and Iberians were Mediterranean. They were Southern Europeans or Mediterranean peoples. And they had quite, at the time, little or nothing to do with the Nordic barbarians, the people north of the Danube, east of the Rhine, and up around the North Sea and the Baltic, and the Irish Sea. They had very little or nothing to do with these people. And some of these barbarian tribes, in fact, had virtually no contact with the Romans, or even with the barbarian kingdoms that replaced the Romans in Western Europe for the first few centuries. So a lot of Europe or lots of Europe was never part of the Roman Empire. Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia, Northern and Eastern Europe were never part of the Roman state. Instead, they gradually were converted either by the Roman Catholics, who were chiefly Germans, or German, Scottish, and Irish missionaries, or by Byzantine Greeks from Turkey and Greece, who went north beyond the pale of the Roman frontier to convert the various Slavic, South Slavic, and later Eastern Slavic tribes to Eastern Orthodoxy, beginning in the 9th century and continuing well after that until the fall of Constantinople. But most of the interior of Europe was never had any kind of really influence from the classical world. So I tend to view the Grecian and Roman civilizations as Mediterranean and only marginally European. Instead, European civilization, European culture began with the barbarians that replaced the Romans. And as a matter of fact, European culture is a consequence of a mixture of the Romanic and Germanic cultures. And it is to the Germanic peoples of the north that the origins of the nations of Western Europe have their origins. The core of what is the Germanic world, the Germanic languages, spreads from the Welsh, the Western Welsh lands, and the borders of Hadrian's old wall, all the way down to South Tyrol, bordering Slovenia and Italy. Well, yeah, just South Tyrol, and to Austria, and to the Uber-Neisse River, to the Uber-Neisse River, or I'm sorry, to the El and Naze rivers. It is to the Netherlands, Flanders, England, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, Germany, Austria, parts of Switzerland, most of Switzerland actually, Alsace-Lorraine, South Tyrol, and a whole host of smaller areas like Luxembourg and Liechtenstein that is in fact a testimony of the legacy of these Teutonic peoples. The Germanic tribes were very brutal, very tough, warlike peoples, just like the Vikings a few hundred years later would be. And with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of the Merovingians and the Franks, Europe was very radically transformed. In fact, these centuries of the invading hordes of Huns, Avars, Magyars, Burgundians, Suebi, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Anglo-Saxons, Utes, and a whole host of other peoples had a very radical, very traumatic, and very sudden change on the entire fate of Western and Northern Europe that changed the continent of Europe and, as a matter of fact, the rest of the world forever. The Germanic tribes and peoples by the height of the Viking Age were going as far afield as the Caspian Sea and Vinland in what is now Canada or Newfoundland. Vikings were going beyond the frontiers and the furthest reaches of the Roman state to North America. Their legacy and the testimony of these people is truly amazing. So join with me today as I delve into life in the Teutonic barbarian kingdoms. So, if you look at the church, at the medieval Roman Catholic Church, in the Middle Ages, It's known as the feudal church or the feudal age. And what you see with the church is a very strong preservation of vernacular Latin. Even in Irish monasteries or Hibernian monasteries in Northumbria, England, Latin was preserved. This medieval vernacular Latin, together with these secular Germanic languages. Another consequence, too, of this age of migration and these Germanic migrations was, in fact, the inception of the royal and noble families of Europe. Most of the royal families and the royal dynasties in Europe have their origins from Viking chieftains or from Germanic Dark Age kings. Even today, the British monarchy and the House of Windsor can be traced directly back to the House of Wessex. Yes, there have been dynastic shifts. There was the Norman Conquest, the Glorious Revolution in 1688, as well as a host of other subsequent events. But nonetheless, the British royal family and the royal houses of Scandinavia and the royal house of Spain can all trace back in one form or another to almost the exact same Germanic tribes. The only exception is the royal Serbian house, which is Slavic or has a Slavic origins. But from the early Middle Ages onwards, and especially from the Carolingian age, there is a lot of intermarrying between the various dynasties and noble houses of Europe, from Hungary to Norway to Scotland to Poland to Moravia to Spain. All of these various different royal houses are very much interwoven and interlaid with one another. So I wanted to point that out. So, anyways, and of course, the Catholic Church, which was really the only bastion, the only institution in all of antiquity that survived the transition of this age of migration. So, anyways, I just wanted to make sure to explain all of that stuff before I continue. So now I will continue on with life in the Germanic barbarian kingdoms. Um, Fascinating time period. So, what sort of an impact did the Germanic tribes actually have? Let's find out. Germanic tribes and spirituality. Origins. So now I have seen this question 4 times before in this group. What is the relationship between the Celtic and Germanic culture? Both cultures share many similarities when you look at their gods and customs. Even the Romans sometimes mixed them up, yet both cultures are still two separate and different cultures. To answer this question, we have to go back to the end of the Copper Age and the early Bronze Age. So it is to the Yamnaya steppe peoples of the late Chalcolithic. It is to the Unitusi culture in what is now Western Poland, that is in fact the origins of the hoarded ware culture. And it is from this culture that the battle axe people, and from them the Nordic Bronze Age, and from that the Germanic people derive from. The Yamnaya culture, also known as the Proto-Indo-European people, lived around what is now called the Russian steppes. These people lived as nomads and were skilled horsemen. Hordes of these Yamnaya horsemen decided to migrate towards the west around 3000 BC. They brought along their gods, languages, culture, and a lot of misery. Modern DNA research and archaeological evidence can easily confirm the invasion theory. All over Europe, a sudden change of burial customs can be observed from somewhere around 2800 BC. The DNA of European people changed as well, showing how the Yamnaya people replaced the original European population. An estimated 70% of European population got replaced by the invading Yamnaya peoples. As you can guess, the Yamnaya migration didn't exactly go peacefully. In fact, every native male of modern day Spain got wiped out. The females were used by the Yamnaya people to continue reproducing. The Yamnaya people were responsible for the first ever genocide, slaughtering entire populations of which traces have been found in the form of mass graves in modern day Germany. Almost every modern European carries the DNA of these Yamnaya invaders, also known as the R1b haplogroup. Within 800 years, these Yamnaya people replaced and resettled most of Europe. These invaders spoke the Proto-Indo-European language and had their own pantheon of gods. The chief god was called Deus, out of which Tewaz, Tyr, or Tyre developed, and later still Wodanes, Odin. Over time, this language evolved in all parts of Europe into new languages like the Proto-Celtic. It's actually the Proto-Celto-Latin or Proto-Latano-Celtic and Proto-Germanic language. The Proto-Indo-European gods evolved as well. The earliest Celtic culture developed from Yamnaya-influenced people below the big rivers like the Rhine, in what is now the Alps. The Hallstatt culture developed around 800 BC, together with the first Proto-Celtic language. This Celtic culture spread to the north into Belgium, the Netherlands, England, and Germany. It also spread southwards towards northern Italy and Spain, to the west in France, and to the east into Czech, Austria, Slovakia, and Hungary. Meanwhile, all in the north, the Yamnaya influenced people of modern day Denmark, Sweden, Norway, northern Germany, and the northern parts of the Netherlands developed their own culture as well during a period which is now known as the Nordic Bronze Age. This Nordic Bronze Age is the true ancestor of the Germanic culture. This Bronze Age dates back to around 1700 BC until 500 BC, after which the Germanic Iron Age started, which ended when the early medieval ages started. During this Nordic Bronze Age, the foundation of the Germanic culture developed. Think of the rock carvings in Sweden, the worship of Sunna, and the ritual sacrifice of humans into bogs. During the Nordic Bronze Age, the Proto-Germanic language developed as well. The Proto-Celtic language later developed into different languages in different areas. 4 of these languages still exist until this day: Welsh, Breton, Irish, and Gaelic. Unfortunately, the Celtic languages of mainland Europe have gone extinct. The Proto-Germanic language developed into many languages we still know and speak until this day, like all of the Scandinavian languages except Finnish, which is Finno-Ugric. Finnish is a Finno-Ugric language. German, Dutch, English, Frisian. Celtic territory was huge until around 400 BC. Basically, a large part of Europe was Celtic until several Germanic tribes decided to migrate southwards. They clashed with the Celts and pushed them back until the river Rhine. On several occasions, the Germanic people tried to push beyond the Rhine but were pushed back. One of their last attempts was in 58 BC, during which the Celts asked the Romans to help them defeat the Germanics. This was probably a very bad decision, because this led to Kai Cyr invading Gaul, conquering it for Rome and killing countless of people during his genocidal campaign. The Celts and Germanics continued to clash with each other over the centuries, but they sometimes also came together to form alliances against common enemies like the Romans. All of the tribes living around the border between Celtic and Germanic territory became influenced with each other. Some Celtic tribes became Germanic. Some Germanic tribes became Celtic through both violence and trade. Here is the answer to the question: what is the relationship between the Celtic and Germanic people? They are two different cultures, but they have the same roots. Their cultures both developed from the Yamnaya culture, which was brought into Europe during the Bronze Age. I can write post later showing the exact similarities between the Celtic, Germanic, Greek, Roman, and Slavic culture. Here are pictures of a map of the Yamnaya culture, Proto-Indo-European language tree, map of the Celtic territory before the Germanic migration southward, map of Proto-Germanic territory, mass grave of people killed by the Yamnaya, and a map spread of the R1b. So this right here is a good testament to the legacy of both the Yamnaya Unitici and the later Celtic and Germanic migrations, all the way down until the end of the Viking Age. This was a time of massive movement and upswing of peoples and tremendous changes that affected the entire European continent and had a tremendous impact in the early Middle Ages. Every bit as what the Yamnaya migrations had a few thousand years earlier. Genetics of the Nordic Bronze Age. Bronze Age Scandinavia, massive burial mounds. All right, let me make sure. All right, so the Germanic culture in Scandinavia got its start in the pitted ware culture, which was a branch of the hoarded ware. Bronze Age Scandinavia, massive burial mounds full of wealth, groups of armed men with bronze weapons manning boats, status-obsessed hierarchical warriors and traders, the likeliest candidates for pre-Proto-Germanic speakers, and a Proto-Germanic material culture. But who are they, and where do they come from? The people of the Nordic Bronze Age were skilled metal workers and seafarers. They were expert traders, capable of running extensive trade networks. They were the ancestors of not only the Germanic tribes of the migration period, but also of the Vikings. This highly stratified society, ruled by an aristocratic elite, laid the foundation for much of what would become the Germanic peoples. In order to understand their genetic profile, we have to go back even further in time, to a much more turbulent time, Neolithic and Chalcolithic Europe. Autosomal DNA. The Nordic Bronze Age people show clear signs of genetic continuity from the late Neolithic Scandinavians. This was a genetic profile that had fully formed by 2100 BC in the southern parts of Norway and Sweden, as well as in Denmark. This is the development of the late Neolithic Scandinavian dagger period associated with the spread of flint daggers. The genetic profile of the late Neolithic Scandinavians and the battle and the NBA people can best be described as a mix of the battle axe culture, single grave culture, and the beaker culture. Funnel beaker culture. These three populations met and mingled in Scandinavia. It is possible that they had also had small amounts of SHG, Scandinavian hunter-gatherer ancestry from the pitted ware culture. Below, we'll go through what this actually means and who the people of these ancient populations were. Pitted ware culture. In order to understand who the people of the Nordic Bronze Age and the populations ancestral to them were, it is important to gain an understanding of who lived in Scandinavia before them. The original inhabitants of Scandinavia were the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, known to archaeologists as SHG, Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, which is the short terminology. The PWC people were their descendants, a group of hardy foragers who were highly adapted to the brutally harsh environment that they had originally settled in around 9,000 years ago. They belonged to the genetic cluster known as SHG, which was first identified in 6 hunter-gatherer individuals from Motala, Sweden. Dated to from Motala, Sweden, dated to 6000 BC. The SHG were a mix of WHG and EHG, the former having colonized Scandinavia from the south and the latter from the northeast. Just like most Mesolithic and Neolithic, which was technically the case for PWC, hunter-gatherers of Europe, they existed on a WHG, EHG genetic line. In some parts of Scandinavia, they were more shifted toward the WHG cluster, while in other parts they had more EHG admixture and were thus more EHG shifted. Their diet mainly consisted of seafood and meat, and they were genetically adapted to the cold. This is strengthened by the presence of the protein TMEM131, which is associated with long-term adaptation to cold in SHG DNA samples. Interestingly, this gene is also present in modern-day Northern Europeans. Physically, they were tall, fit, and robust. In terms of Y DNA samples from PWC, skeletons revealed 12 haplogroups, mainly of the I2A1 branch. This branch was common among earlier SHG from Motala in Sweden, Steigen in Norway, and Hummervikholmen in Norway as well. It is nearly non-existent among present-day Scandinavians. It is possible that present-day Scandinavians have small amounts of ancestry from PWC. However, results from the study on the topic, Malmstrom 2009, showed that there isn't much autosomal continuity between the PWC hunter-gatherers and the modern Scandinavians. This suggests that these hunter-gatherers were simply replaced by the incoming groups, such as the battle axe culture. As such, it comes as no surprise that the people of the Nordic Bronze Age do not seem to have significant ancestry from the pitted ware culture, which we'll get to later on below. The idea that modern North Europeans don't have much autosomal DNA continuity from SHG is not unique to Malmstrom's study. I might add, together, Gunther et al. 2018 did not make the same conclusion. Instead, this paper proposed that present-day Northern Europeans do have some degree of SHG admixture. Another study by Malmstrom 2015 also hinted at there being at least some autosomal contribution from the PWC to present-day Scandinavians. While speculative, it just might be from the pitted ware culture, or from another group of more northeastern, perhaps SHG, that Scandinavians get their mysterious I1Y DNA haplogroup. But that's a topic that is complicated enough to deserve its own article. There is extensive evidence of PWC pitted ware culture being quite a violent culture. Spectacular finds of pitted ware culture arrowheads inside human skulls have been made. A study on the topic, Iverson 2016, even found that the PWC had different types of arrowheads, one of which was dedicated solely to warfare instead of hunting. This suggests that for a relatively primitive hunter-gatherer culture, the PWC had a rather sophisticated style of tribal warfare. In addition to that, the hunter-gatherers of the pitted ware culture were not very keen on other groups intruding on their territory, which brings us to the next ancient population that entered Scandinavia, funnel beaker culture. The earliest agriculturalist to ever enter Scandinavia, the funnel beaker people, were a unique group of people with a real frontier mentality. Agriculture was introduced to Europe by an ancestral genetic group called EEF, early European farmers. They entered Europe through Anatolia and formed many different and for their time highly advanced cultures. Archaeological remains of these cultures can be found in all corners of Europe, from Iberia to Britain to Poland and Scandinavia. However, it can be said that the places where agriculture had the least success was Scandinavia, and what is now the Baltic countries as well as Finland. The funnel beaker people settled Scandinavia from the south, going from Germany to Denmark and the southern parts of Norway and Sweden. Conditions for the relatively primitive form of agriculture that they practiced were not ideal in this region, especially not in Norway and Sweden. Thus, these early farmers faced many difficulties. This may be the reason why Scandinavians have one of the lowest percentual levels of ancestry from EEF in Europe. In Europe, only the Balts and the Finns carry lower levels of EEF ancestry than Scandinavians do. In terms of Y-DNA, current finds of DNA show that the men of the FBC culture mainly carried haplogroup I2 with a minority of G2A lineages. These Y DNA lineages are rare among present-day Scandinavians, suggesting that there is little to no continuity from the FBC, but still significant autosomal contribution. The funnel beaker people had a rather different genetic profile from the earliest farmers who entered Europe through Anatolia. Funnel beaker people often had very high levels of indigenous European hunter gatherer ancestry. This ancestry component is called WHG, Western Hunter Gatherer Ancestry, and in modern times it reaches its peak in Baltic people, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, followed by Finns, Basque, and Scandinavians, in that order. In some funnel beaker individuals, WHG ancestry made up as 50% of the total DNA. Interestingly enough, their hunter gatherer DNA was reflected in their customs, which differed from that of other EEF groups. Funnel beaker groups were often less sedentary than other early farmers, relying more on hunting and fishing and slightly less on grains to survive. In addition to that, they also herded cattle. Some research has even suggested that the funnel beaker culture was more lactose tolerance. Some research has even suggested that the funnel beaker culture was where lactose tolerance first evolved in Europe. In the areas previously inhabited by people of the funnel beaker culture, present day lactose tolerance reaches its peak everywhere in Europe. That's the ability to consume milk, in case you don't know what that actually is. It's the ability to consume milk. Lactose tolerance is the ability to consume milk and dairy products. There is evidence of the inhabitants of the funnel beaker settlements building primitive palisades for defensive purposes towards the end of the TRB phase. It has been established that the hunter-gatherers of the PWC may have directed violent efforts against the FBC, and it is even possible that this triggered a remigration of FBC people out of Sweden and Norway through Denmark and into North Germany in the late TRB phase. However, the signs of remigration that we can observe may also have been caused by the difficulties that agriculturalists faced due to the poor soil and hostile terrain of Norway and Sweden. The difficulties and harsh conditions for funnel beaker people around the Oslo Fjord were especially extreme, being raided by bands of hunter-gatherers probably didn't make things any better. The FBC people buried their dead in collective megalith graves. The culture existed between 4300 BC until 2800 BC. Skeletal remains from the funnel beaker culture have revealed that they were relatively short in stature. They were often mesocephalic, which means that their heads were neither very long nor very short. Round face shapes may have been common among them, likely a result of deriving their ancestry from both robust and wide-faced hunter-gatherers and from more long-faced and glacial Anatolian farmers. While funnel beaker remains from Germany tend to resemble the remains of other EEF, especially the ones from the globular amphora culture, those from Denmark and Sweden were more robust and only exhibit minor changes from the Mesolithic skeletons in the same area. Benica, 1985 and 1993. This ancient genetic component is represented by DNA from skeletal remains associated with the funnel beaker culture from Poland, Germany, and Sweden. Battle axe culture. The first Indo-European speakers to enter Scandinavia, the people of the battle axe culture, were a highly mobile and relatively warlike group. The culture is characterized by their distinctive boat-shaped battle axes made of flint, which were used as status symbols in burials. The Proto-Indo-European languages are believed to have been introduced to Europe by pastoralists from the Pontic Caspian steppe, belonging to the Yamnaya culture. Their ancestral DNA component is called the WSH, Western Steppe Herder component, or sometimes simply the Yamnaya component. The Yamnaya WSH were a mix of two populations, EHG, Eastern hunter-gatherers from Eastern Europe, and CHG, Caucasus hunter-gatherers from the Caucasus region. The Yamnaya pastoralists rapidly migrated to Europe and, in most places, replaced the Y haplogroups of the local men. Offshoots of the Yamnaya culture developed into the corded ware culture, which in turn developed into different offshoots. The battle axe culture was the Scandinavian offshoot of the corded ware culture. The people of the early corded ware culture in Poland and Germany were already mixed to some degree with the local EEF people. However, in early CWC individuals, this admixture was not particularly high. As the CWC people entered Scandinavia, their EEF ancestry increased as they mixed with the locals, but remained relatively low. Corded ware people carried roughly 75% Yamnaya admixture, while modern North Europeans carry about 50% on average. This means that the CWC people plot somewhere in between Yamnaya and North Europeans on the PCA. In terms of Y-DNA, the men of the BAC mainly carried haplogroups R1A, in particular the Scandinavian R1A Z284 subclad that is common in present-day Norway and Sweden. They likely also carried a minority of R1b and possibly in the latest phase I1 lineages. The battle axe culture relied on both cattle herding and agriculture for sustenance. They did not always settle in one place, but consistently moved around across Scandinavia, showing a slight preference for the inland areas as opposed to coastal areas. The BAC burial system involved individual graves, which was a stark difference in comparison to the collective megalith graves of the previous funnel beaker culture. Evidence suggests that they were far more individualistic than the more collectivist funnel beaker culture. The battle axe culture existed between 2800 until 2300 BC. Skeletal remains from battle axe individuals show that they were a tall and long-limbed people who were often dolichocephalic. This means that many of them had skulls that were longer relative to their width, and likely rather long faces. The BAC people almost certainly inherited their height from their Yamnaya ancestors. Yamnaya have the highest ever predicted genetic height of any ancient population. The BAC genetic component is represented in skeletal remains associated with the battle axe culture from Sweden. Single grave culture. Similar to the battle axe culture, the single grave culture was an offshoot of the Indo-European corded ware culture. The SJC occupied much of the western part of the European plain, mainly parts of present-day Denmark, Netherlands, and Germany. As the name of the culture implies, the SGC people buried their dead in single graves. These single graves often involved burial mounds. The mounds would contain coffins in which the dead were placed. The kurgans, or burial mounds, had their ultimate origin in the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. The burial mound, sometimes also called tumulus or kurgan burial type, became the standardized type of burial during the Nordic Bronze Age, especially so among the elites. The SJC practiced basic agriculture and cattle herding. Genetically, the single grave people were fairly similar to those of the battle axe culture. Both hailed from the CWC and ultimately from the Yamnaya-related source population, and thus carried a high percentage of Western steppe herder ancestry. Much like other middle phase corded ware people, they had about 75% Yamnaya-related ancestry. In terms of Y-DNA, current finds from the SJC are sparse. However, it is likely that they mainly carried various subclads of haplogroup R1b. One male from the SJC burial in Gujarat carried haplogroup R1b V1636. Physically, the SJC people were tall and robustly built. While their skulls were fairly long, the Bell Beaker people were closely related to the SJC people. Who were closely related to the SJC people were notably brachycephalic, meaning that they had skulls that were shorter and wider than typical. Nordic Bronze Age. So this finally brings us to the NBA. Seeing as they were a mix of these three populations mentioned above, they had unsurprisingly also adopted customs and characteristics from all three. This involved animal husbandry and herding, agriculture and hunting, fishing and gathering. Rich archaeological remains from this cultural sphere suggest that the Nordic Bronze Age was a highly prosperous and wealthy culture. Some of the artifacts left behind can even give us an insight into their religion, which has often been suggested to have revolved around the sun, as some sort of solar cult. Take the Trundholm chariot, for example. Just like a lot of other NBA artifacts, it has spiraling patterns. Looking at swords, The same circular solar patterns can be observed. The Trundholm chariot would likely originally have consisted of not one, but two horses. Both horses may have been pulling a representation of the sun. It is possible that the sun worship served multiple purposes. Not only was it related to crops, harvest, and fertility, but possibly also to gold and wealth. The people of the Nordic Bronze Age loved bright metals, and it's not impossible that this was because gold and bronze reminded them of the powerful and important sun. Now let's get into some more details regarding the genetic profile of these sun worshipping people. The first study to sequence whole genomes from Nordic Bronze Age individuals, Allentoft 2015, found that the NBA people had a strong genetic affinity to the corded ware culture, Uinta culture, and even the Sintashta culture. Nordic Bronze Age people were found to have the highest levels of lactose tolerance among Bronze Age Europeans. There was a strong and relatively drawn out skeleton. There was a strong and relatively drawn out selection for lactose persistence in Northern Europe during this period, has shown in Berger et al. 2020. The Nordic Bronze Age people were tall and on average mesocephalic. They had skulls that were neither very long nor very short. In terms of Y DNA, current samples have yielded haplogroups I1 and R1b. However, the samples thus far are only from southern Sweden and Denmark, causing a slight sample bias. The typically Scandinavian R1a Z284 will almost certainly be found in remains from the Nordic Bronze Age in future studies, along with other lineages, some of which may not be common today. By the time of the late Neolithic, this Scandinavian trio of Y-DNA lineages had already emerged, along with the Nordic LN genetic cluster that I mentioned in the start of this article. Thus, there is a noticeable continuity from the late Neolithic into the Nordic Bronze Age, not just in terms of autosomal DNA, but also when it comes to Y-DNA haplogroups. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. Below is a rather simplified principal component analysis, PCA, that was made using the Global 25 tool created by David Wezolowski. What we see in that modern Scandinavians represented in the PCA has simply Norwegian, Swedish, Danish form a cluster together with the late Neolithic and Bronze Age populations from Sweden and Denmark. They also positioned themselves very close to populations like battle axe and corded ware. This cluster has some slight variation, with the Norwegians and Swedes generally being closer in distance to corded ware, and the Danes being closer to the Danish Bronze Age individuals, simply due to the slightly higher EEF component among Danes and the slightly higher Yamnaya component among Norwegians and Swedes. If we were to add the Danish single grave culture sample from Gudgerald, he would position himself nicely among the rest of the Scandinavian cluster. useful, a bit slightly outdated WHG, WSH, EEF ancestry proportions in Europeans from Hayek et al. 2015. I have added the RUS Centashta MLBA population average, represented by DNA from likely Proto-Indo-Iranian speakers from the steppe, simply because of the proposed cultural Centashta or Centashta-like influence on the Nordic Bronze Age culture. The earliest known chariot has been found in a Centashta culture burial, and these were the people of the culture that developed into the Andronovo culture and likely invaded India, bringing with them their language and culture. The cultural similarities between these corded ware derived cultures can be observed in Nordic Bronze Age artifacts such as the Trondholm chariot from Denmark, as can be seen in the PCA. Scandinavians do show some very minor affinity towards steppe MLBA populations like Centashta. However, this is not due to direct admixture, but simply due to shared ancestral components. The modern populations closest to Shintashta would be various Eastern European populations. As such, the visual closeness of Scandinavians to Shintashta on this PCA is the result of what's called artificial distance. Shintashta, just like Scandinavians, largely had their origins in the corded ware culture population, but Scandinavians, both Bronze Age, Iron Age, and modern, can better be described as post-CWC populations due to having a higher EEF component. The pitted ware culture is positioned in the upper right corner, closest to modern Finnish and Baltic individuals, which is due to their higher hunter-gatherer admixture. Bear in mind, however, that the genetic distance between the PWC and any modern population is rather massive, and not even Balts and Finns can be said to be genetically close to them. Continuing, the PCA seems to show the same thing that Malmstrom 2009 concluded, which is that Bronze Age, Iron Age, and modern Scandinavians do not derive much of their total ancestry from the PWC. Rather, present-day Scandinavians have a very high genetic affinity to the corded ware populations of Scandinavia, the Czech Republic, Germany, and Poland. We can examine to some extent how much corded ware ancestry modern Scandinavians have by creating an admixture model in G25. For the sake of accuracy, let's use scaled coordinates. As proxies for their ancestral components, we can use Polish corded ware samples and Swedish funnel beaker samples. Below are models for Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes. Observe that we are able to model Scandinavians as approximately 70% corded ware and 30% funnel beaker. However, it should be kept in mind that there is significant WHG ancestry in both the Polish corded ware as well as Swedish funnel beaker sample averages. What's interesting is that if we add a pitted ware component, that actually improves the fit for Swedes, but not for Norwegians. With that model, Swedes show 3.2% SHG admixture, 70.2% corded ware admixture, and 26.6% funnel beaker admixture. For Norwegians, no PWC admixture seems to be able to be detected, and their admixture model remains as 71.4% corded ware and 28.6% funnel beaker. Future samples may be able to improve the fit for these admixture models and provide better references for potential SHG contributors as well. Unitacy culture migrants and haplogroup R1b U106, a contributing cultural and genetic factor to the Nordic Bronze Age. So much earlier, I happened to talk about the Unitacy culture, which was a early Bronze Age culture that had a fairly mild contribution genetically, but more so only a cultural contribution. The Unitacy culture was a wide spanning, advanced, and influential Central European Bronze Age culture. It left behind impressive artifacts such as the well known Nebra sky disk. Nebra sky disk. It has been speculated that the decline and collapse of Unitacy caused some of its people to migrate north. This hypothetical migrants perhaps brought new technology, especially related to metallurgy, to the more geographically remote lands of the north. These hypothetical migrants perhaps brought new technology, especially related to metallurgy, to the more geographically remote lands of the north. However, current DNA evidence is unable to prove this. There have been theories circulating about immigrating groups, such as Y-DNA R1b U106 from Central Europe, Unitacy, to Scandinavia just prior to the beginning of the Nordic Bronze Age. While it's impossible that there was such a immigration, the ancient DNA record has shown no evidence of it as of yet. With that said, current finds of R1b U106 dating to the late Neolithic and Bronze Age are quite sparse, and available DNA evidence on this topic may drastically change with future discoveries. On the contrary, it's not impossible that there was some immigration from late Neolithic Scandinavia southwards to Unitacy. Let's examine that possibility. First off, isotopic evidence from a 2013 study showed proof of migration from Sweden to Poland during the early Central European Bronze Age. Dr. Anna Pakuta at Gothenburg University wrote about this in her doctoral thesis called Population Dynamics, Diet and Migrations of the Unitacy Culture in Poland. This isotopic analysis she highlighted showed a male-biased migration from Sweden into the Unitacy culture in the early Central European Bronze Age. Now, if we backtrack just a little bit back to haplogroup R1b U106, ancient DNA samples of R1b U106 are relatively few at the moment, but the oldest sample is currently PNL001, Papak et al. 2021, who was found in an early corded ware culture setting in the Czech Republic. The sample is dated to roughly 2900 BC. After PNL001, there is something of a gap in samples until the second oldest R1b U106 sample, which is indeed sample RISE98 from Skåne, Sweden, Allentoft et al. 2015. RISE98 is dated to 2431 to 2238 BC, and was archaeologically given a cultural assignment to the Scandinavian late Neolithic culture. Given that it is in this context we find the earliest R1b U106 sample in Scandinavia, this dates to some extent this does to some extent speak in favor of the immigration out of Scandinavia to the Unetice culture like the one proposed by Pacuda, but it does not necessitate it. In any case, it certainly proves that the U106 branch was already present in Scandinavia before the Unetice collapse took place and subsequent migration happened, and may even have arrived in Scandinavia with early corded ware groups. It is most likely, however, that it first arrived in Scandinavia alongside late Neolithic migrations from the single grave culture, starting at roughly 2500 BC. Leaving Y-DNA aside for a moment, let us have a look at autosomal DNA. Unetice individuals had ancestry proportions of Yamnaya, WHG, EEF in similar percentages that modern North Europeans do. If we look at where the combined average of Unetice individual samples end up, it's right inside the aforementioned late Neolithic Scandinavian, Bronze Age, and modern Scandinavian cluster. If we use G25 to calculate genetic distance to modern populations, we can see that the Polish Unetice average, German Unetice average, and the Czech Unetice averages all show affinity towards present-day Scandinavians, likely due to artificial distance as a result of similar ancestry proportions, however. Given that the more northern shifted Unetice samples seem quite similar to late Neolithic Scandinavians, the combination of the previously mentioned factors could imply that there were population movements from Scandinavia into the Unetice culture. However, the opposite can still be also true, as this was a period of high mobility. Late Neolithic Nordic populations were so genetically similar to the more steppe and HG shifted parts of the population of the Unetice culture that in the scenario of a migration from Unetice into Scandinavia, we would not necessarily be able to tell that any migration had taken place. The only way to really determine this is if future DNA studies go into further detail regarding specific Y-DNA subclads of late Neolithic populations in, for example, Denmark, while also focusing on strontium isotope ratios. In summary, there is currently no way to say with certainty that there was a migration of Unetice people into Scandinavia just prior to the beginning of the Nordic Bronze Age. If there was, it's likely that this would have been quite a small group of high-status individuals, likely bringing new metallurgy and other pieces of technology. We can safely say that there was at least one migration from Scandinavia into the Unetice culture during the early Central European Bronze Age. Conclusion: to summarize, the people of the Nordic Bronze Age had a high degree of genetic continuity from the late Neolithic people of Scandinavia. Future DNA studies will give us further insight into specifics regarding Y-DNA subclads of the NBA people, as well as clearing some things up in regards to the significant increase in frequency that haplogroups I1 and R1b U106 underwent in Scandinavia in the Nordic Bronze Age. There are some very interesting ongoing research projects that will examine topics like continuity from the Nordic Bronze Age, stretching to the Viking Age, as well as the DNA of more high-status Nordic Bronze Age burials. This is sure to be interesting, but may take a while. So, Yeah. I just wanted to make sure and go ahead and explain the influence of the Unetici culture in this time period and the impact that Scandinavians of the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age had on it. This is a very important precursor to the events that will happen later with the age of migrations. Now I would like to talk about Tacitus's Germania. This is the only work other than that of a 6th century Austro-Gothic writer named Jordanes, who talked about or wrote about the arrival of the Goths in Italy and the Balkans and the Gothic wars of the 6th century. Other than the writings of Jordanes, as well as Tacitus's Germania, there is no other works about Germanic peoples in classical antiquity. Everything else was written well into the Middle Ages. So right now, I just want to make sure that my stream is running. Chat. Are there any interruptions to the stream that is taking place right now? Okay, just let me know. All right, Tacitus's Germania. The various peoples of Germany are separated from the Gauls by the Rhine, from the Rhaetians and Pannonians by the Danube, and from Sarmatians and Dacians by mountains. Or where there are no mountains by mutual fear. The northern parts of the country are girdled by the sea, flowing round broad peninsulas, and vast inlands where a campaign of the present century has revealed to us the existence of some nations of kings hitherto unknown. The Rhine rises in a remote and precipitous height of the Rhaetian Alps, and afterwards turns slightly westwards to flow into the North Sea. The Danube issues from a gentle slope of moderate height in the Black Forest, and after passing more peoples than the Rhine in its course discharges itself into the Black Sea through 6 channels, a 7th mouth being lost in marshlands. Has the Germans themselves, I think it probable, has to the Germans themselves, I think it probable that they are indigenous and that very little foreign blood has been introduced either by invasions or by friendly dealings with neighboring peoples. For in former times it was not by land but on shipboard that would-be immigrants arrived, but the limitless ocean that lies beyond the coasts of Germany, and as it were defies intruders, is seldom visited by ships from our part of the world, and to say nothing of the perils of that wild and unknown area, and to say of the perils and to say nothing of the perils of that wild and unknown sea, who would have been likely to leave Asia Minor, North Africa, or Italy to go to Germany with its forbidden landscapes and unpleasant climate, a country that is thankless to till, and dismal to behold for anyone who was not born or bred there. In the traditional songs, which form their only record of the past, the Germans celebrate an earth-born god called Teusto. His son Manus is supposed to be the fountainhead of their race, and himself to have begotten three sons who gave their names to three groups of tribes: the Engeviones, nearest the sea, and the Herminones in the interior, and the Isteavones, who comprise all the rest. Some authorities, with the freedom of conjecture permitted by remote antiquity, assert that Tuesto had more numerous descendants, and mention more tribal groups such as the Marzi, Gambrivi, Siubi, and Vandili, names which they affirm to be both genuine and ancient. The name Germania, however, is said to have been only recently applied to the country. The first peoples to cross the Rhine and appropriate Gallic territory, though they are known nowadays as Tungri, were at the time called German, and that was at first the name of this one tribe, not of the entire race. Gradually came into general use in the wider sense. It first applied to the whole people by the conquerors of the Gauls. To frighten them, later all the Germans adopted it and called themselves by the new name. The Germans, like many other peoples, are said to have been visited by Hercules, and they sing of him as the foremost of all the heroes when they are about to engage in battle. Ulysses also, in all those fabled wanderings of his, is supposed by some to have reached the northern sea and visited German lands, to have founded and named Ascaburgium, a town on the Rhine inhabited to this day. They even add that an altar consecrated by Ulysses and inscribed also with the name of his father Laertes was discovered long ago at the same place, and that certain barrows with monuments upon them bearing Greek inscriptions still exist on the borders of Germany and Rhaetia. I do not intend to argue either for or against these assertions. Each man must accept or reject them as he feels inclined. They also have a well-known kind of chant that they call Baratus. By the rendering of this, they not only kindle their courage, but merely by listening to the sound, they can forecast the issue of an approaching engagement. For they either terrify their foe, or themselves become frightened, according to the character of the noise they make upon the battlefield, and they regard it not merely as so many voices chanting together, but as a unison of valor. What they particularly aim at is a harsh, intermittent roar, and they hold their shields in front of their mouths, so that the sound is amplified in a deeper crescendo by the reverberation. For myself, I accept the views that the peoples of Germany have never contaminated themselves by intermarriage with foreigners, but remain of pure blood, distinct, and unlike any other nation. One result of this is that their physical characteristics, insofar as one can generalize about such a large population, are always the same: fierce-looking blue eyes, reddish hair, and big frames, which, however, can exert their strength only by means of violent effort. They are also able to endure toil and fatiguing tasks, and cannot bear thirst or heat, though their climate has inured them to cold spells, and the poverty of their soil to hunger. The appearance of the country differs considerably in different parts, but in general it is covered either by bristling forests or by foul swamps. It is wetter on the side that faces Gaul, windier on the side of Noricum and Pannonia. A good soil for cereal crops. It will not grow fruit trees. It is well provided with livestock, but the animals are mostly undersized, and even the cattle lack the handsome heads that are their natural glory. It is the mere number of them that the Germans take pride in, for these are the only form of wealth they have, and are much prized. Silver and gold have been denied them, whether as a sign of divine favor or of divine wrath, I cannot say. Yet I would not positively assert that there are no deposits of silver or gold in Germany, since no one has prospected for them. The natives take less pleasure than most people do in possessing and handling these metals. Indeed, one can see that in their houses, silver vessels, which have been presented to chieftains or to ambassadors traveling abroad, put to the same everyday uses as earthenware. Those who live on the frontiers nearest us, however, do value gold and silver for their use in commerce, being quick to recognize and pick out certain of our coin types. They like old-fashioned coins because they have been long familiar with them, especially those which have notched edges and are stamped with representations of two-horse chariots. They also prefer silver to gold, not from any special liking for the metal, but because a quantity of silver coins is more convenient for buying ordinary cheap merchandise. They choose their kings for their noble birth, their commanders for their valor. The power even of the kings is not absolute or arbitrary. The commanders rely on example rather than on authority of their rank, on the admiration they win by showing conspicuous energy and courage, and by pressing forward in front of their own troops. Capital punishment, imprisonment, even flogging are allowed to none but the priests, and are not inflicted merely as punishments or on the commander's orders, but as it were in obedience to the God whom the Germans believe to be present on the field of battle. They actually carry with them into the fight certain figures and emblems taken from their sacred groves. Especially powerful incitement of valor is that the squadrons and divisions are not made up at random by the mustering of chance comers, but are each composed of men of one family or clan. Close to them, too, are their nearest and dearest, so that they can hear the shrieks of their women folk and the wailing of their children. These are the witnesses whom each man reverences most highly, whose praise he most desires. It is their mothers and wives that they go to have their wounds treated, and the women are not afraid to count and compare the gashes. They also carry supplies of food to the combatants and encourage them. It stands on record that armies already wavering and on the point of collapse have been rallied by the women, pleading heroically with their men, thrusting forward their bared bosoms and making them realize the imminent prospect of enslavement, a fate which the Germans fear more desperately for their women than for themselves. Indeed, you can secure a surer hold on these nations if you compel them to include among the consignment of hostages some girls of noble family. More than this, they believe that there resides in women an element of holiness and a gift of prophecy, and so do not scorn to ask their advice or lightly disregard their replies. In the reign of the Emperor Vespasian, we saw Velida, long honored by many Germans as a divinity, and even earlier they showed a similar reverence for Eurinia and a number Erinia and a number of others, a reverence untainted by servile flattery or any presence of turning women into goddesses. Above all other gods they worship Mercury, and count it no sin on certain feast days to include human victims in the sacrifices offered to him. Hercules and Mars they appease by offerings of animals, in accordance with ordinary civilized custom. Some of the Suebi sacrifice also to Isis. I do not know the origin or explanation of this foreign cult, but the goddess's emblem being made in the form of a light warship itself proves that her warship came in from abroad. The Germans do not think it in keeping with the divine majority to confine gods within walls, or to portray them in the likeness of any human countenance. Their holy places are woods and groves, and they apply the names of the deities at that hidden presence which is seen only by the eye of reverence. For omens and casting of lots they have the highest regard. Their procedure in casting lots is always the same. They cut off a branch of a nut-bearing tree and slice it into strips. These they mark with different signs and throw them completely at random into a white cloth. Then the priest of the state, if the consultation is a public one, or the father of the family it is private, offers a prayer to the gods, and looking up at the sky picks up 3 strips, one at a time, and reads their meaning from the signs previously scored on them. If the lots forbid an enterprise, there is no deliberation that day on the matter in question. If they allow it, confirmation by the taking of auspices is required. Although the familiar method of seeking information from the cries and the flight of birds is known to the Germans, they have also a special method of their own, to try to obtain omens and warnings from horses. These horses are kept at the public expense in the sacred woods and groves that I have mentioned. They are pure white and undefiled by any toil in the service of man. The priest and the king or the chief of the state yoke them to a sacred chariot and walk beside them, taking note of their knives and snorts. No kind of omen inspires greater trust, not only among the common people, but even among the nobles and priests, who think that they themselves are the servants of the gods, whereas the horses are privy to the gods' counsels. There is yet another kind of omen taking used to forecast the issue of serious wars. They contrive somehow to secure a captive from the nation with which they are at war, and match them against a champion of their own, each being armed with his national weapons. The victory of one or the other is thought to forecast the issue of war. And so this is Tacitus's Germania. This is the very first large and greatly compiled um, book or novel about the ancient Germanic people. This also gives a lot of great detail about what life was like in the Germanic Iron Age, or during the Iron Age for the Germanic tribes or the Germanic peoples. Now, before the expansion of the Romans, there was really more so, at least in Western and Central Europe, a Celtic dominance across the continent of Europe. The Romans completely disrupted this and wiped out the Celtic tribal customs. By the time that the Roman Empire declined and fell, it was the Germans that were the dominant ethnic group in barbarian Europe, or barbarian occupied Europe. And subsequently, because of their numbers, their fearless valor, their desire to die for honor and for valor, and just overall their warrior and pagan heathen customs, they were able to overpower and subdue the Roman garrisons and legions. And out of the fallen state of the Western Roman Empire, or even in areas that the Romans had already abandoned, various barbarian states arose. A lot of these barbarian states, including the Franks, paid imperial tribute to the emperor in Constantinople. They were seen as client kings, and even as far away as Wales, Welsh kings at Tintagel paid tribute and homage to the Byzantine emperor. And for a few decades, and even for almost 100 years, well into the mid 6th century AD, various Gothic and barbarian kings would continue to do homage and pay tribute as client barbarian kings to the Byzantine emperor. But regardless, classical antiquity was extirpated. We are now in the Middle Ages. Who were the barbarian successor kingdoms of the Western Roman Empire? The barbarian successor kingdoms emerged in the territories of the former Western Roman Empire, including Vandals, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Franks. This is by Vedran Belita, M.A. in Late Antiquity, Master's degree in Late Antique, Byzantine, and Early Modern History, Bachelor's degree in History. The barbarian successor kingdoms were the powerful states that emerged in the territory of the Western Roman Empire following the fall of Rome in 476 CE. The kingdoms were established by the most powerful Germanic tribes, including the Franks in the area of modern day France and Germany, the Vandals in northern Africa, the Ostrogoths in Italy, and the Visigoths in Spain. To say that those kingdoms were barbarian is problematic, as the barbarian kings of post Roman Europe inherited Roman customs, religion, and way of life. The barbarian kings even issued coins based on the imperial coinage of the vanished Western Roman Empire. In addition, while practically independent, some kings like Ostrogoths and Vandals recognized the nominal rule of the Eastern Roman emperors in Constantinople. However, the reconquest of Emperor Justinian in the mid 6th century annihilated most of those successor states, with the Franks being the only ones who established a flourishing medieval kingdom. The Ostrogoths were the most powerful barbarian successor kingdom. Coin depicting Ostrogoth king Theodoric the Great, who reigned from 493 to 526. It is almost impossible to tell if this is a Roman emperor from the 4th century or a barbarian king in the 6th. The Roman imperial influence is overwhelming, even though this is in fact an Ostrogothic king. The Ostrogoths established the most powerful barbarian successor kingdom in post-Roman Europe. They were one of the Germanic tribes that crossed the Danube and settled in the Balkans after the catastrophic defeat of the Eastern Roman army at Adrianople in the late 4th century CE. For decades, they served as the Foederati, or allies of the Roman emperors in both East and the West. And when the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, the Ostrogoths exploited the opportunity, founding the powerful Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy. Under King Theodoric, Ostrogothic Italy retained the Roman style of life. Theodoric continued to rule from Ravenna, the old capital of the Roman emperors, and kept the Senate as the key part of the government. The Ostrogoths also built majestic churches and monumental structures across the kingdom, of which the most famous is the mausoleum of Theodoric in Ravenna. However, the ascension of Emperor Justinian to the throne in Constantinople led to a bloody and protracted war, which ended in the destruction of the Ostrogothic kingdom. The Vandals were masters of North Africa and the Western Mediterranean. Mosaic from Bar Jeded, near the site of Carthage, showing a Vandal aristocrat and a fortified city, late 5th to early 6th century CE, the British Museum in London. And by the way, this is actually the thumbnail of this stream. This is a perfect representation of the transition from an imperial, bureaucratic, Mediterranean organized universal state to a more moderate, local and regional feudal estate system. From the world of classical antiquity to the world of the feudal Middle Ages. This is, I think, a very good representation of that change. The Vandals appeared in the Roman territory in the early 5th century. Facing almost no opposition, this Germanic tribe quickly moved southwards, establishing their presence in modern-day Spain. Under King Gazaric, the Vandals invaded North Africa in 429, defeating the Roman army and establishing a powerful kingdom with a center in Carthage. The Romans would do little to stop the formidable Vandal forces, who in 455 sacked Rome, dealing a significant blow to the prestige of the Western Roman Empire. The Vandal naval power rivaled the Roman navy in the Mediterranean for the first time since the Punic Wars. While the Vandals proved to be a great threat to the Romans, They were not mindless barbarians and were a far cry from the modern Vandals. The Vandal kings and elite continued Roman life, building lavish villas and patronizing art and culture. However, the religious conflict between Arian and Orthodox Christians in the mid 6th century led to the Roman military expedition. Emperor Justinian dispatched General Belisarius, who in a lightning offensive defeated Vandal forces led by King Gelamer, ending the Vandal kingdom for good. The Visigoths ruled Spain. Visigoth gold coin featuring Hermenegild, 584 CE via the British Museum. The Visigoths were a Germanic tribe that established a kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal, following the fall of Rome. They are perhaps best known for the infamous sack of Rome in 410 under their king Alaric. However, the Visigoths were more than brutal barbarians. Under the rule of the Visigothic kings, Spain prospered in a kingdom that blended both Roman and Gothic cultures. The Visigoths are also known for their legal code, Liber EU Decorium, one of the most advanced legal systems in early medieval Europe. Like the other barbarian successor kings, the Visigothic rulers continued the Roman way of life, establishing schools and patronizing art. They also played a role in the spread of Christianity, particularly Arian Christianity, which was influential in the early medieval period. Like the other barbarian successor kingdoms, the Visigoths too became a target of the Justinian reconquest of the Roman West. The Roman army occupied southern Spain, but could not achieve complete control over the area. Instead, the end of the Visigoth kingdom would come from another enemy, the Arab conquest in the 7th century. And finally, we come to the most influential of the barbarian successor states. The Franks were the most successful barbarian successor kingdom. The Baptism of Clovis by Françoise Louise de Jeunet. The Franks emerged as a powerful force in post-Roman Europe. They went on to establish a kingdom that not only outlived the other barbarian successor kingdoms, but also played a crucial role in the formation of medieval Europe. The Franks arrived in Roman Gaul in the 4th century, initially serving in the imperial armies and as the Roman allies. Following the collapse of the Roman West, the Franks under King Clovis established a powerful kingdom that extended from modern-day France to Germany. Franks initially maintained the Roman lifestyle, but gradually established their own ruled by Salic law. It was the beginning of the feudal system, in which the king was a supreme ruler, with other nobles and officials serving under him. The king gave the nobles the land in exchange for their loyalty and military service. During the Merovingian dynasty, the Franks consolidated their hold over most of Western Europe, fighting the Arabs or the Saracens in Spain and the Lombards in Italy. The Frankish kingdom reached the apex under Charlemagne, who in 800 was granted the title of the Roman Emperor by the Pope. Under his rule, the Franks established an empire that included much of modern day France, Germany, and Italy. Charlemagne's empire was one of the largest and most powerful of the time, leaving a lasting influence on Europe's history and culture. And this was written by Vedran Balita, or Vedran Balita, Belata. Now, I want to go north of the Channel to Britain. I want to go to Celtic Britain and talk a bit about the events after the Romans left. Sub-Roman Britain, an introduction by Christopher Snyder. Sub-Roman Britain is a label applied by specialists to Britannia in the 5th and 6th centuries AD. Geographically, Britannia is that territory south of the Fourth Clyde line that was part of the Roman Empire from AD 43 to 410. Gaining their independence from Rome, the sub-Roman Britons created a culture that was a unique hybrid of Roman, native Celtic, and Christian elements. These first 2 centuries of the early Middle Ages also gave birth to medieval kingdoms that would become England, Scotland, and Wales. Vibrant yet enigmatic, the sub-Roman period came to an end with the expansion of the Anglo-Saxons westward in the late 6th century and the establishment of a Roman ecclesiastical mission in Kent in 597. This period has become more popularly known as the Age of Arthur. Both King Arthur and Merlin are associated with these 2 centuries. Arthur has a war leader battling the Saxon invaders, and Merlin has a British bard with prophetic gifts. Modern quests for the historical Arthur, e.g. Alcock 1971, Morris 1973, Ashe 1985, and Merlin, Tolstoy 1985 have increased popular interest in the period, but have convinced few historians. All right, so we finally have made it to the Arthurian legends and the Arthurian tales. This period of British history is generally referred to as the Arthurian Age. It is a very semi-mythical, semi-historical period of which legends and myths are intertwined with history. However, most of the history of this period was actually written later. And in fact, King Arthur is not even mentioned until the 9th century in medieval Wales. This is hundreds of years after King Arthur was supposed to have even lived. So, anyways, yeah, this is a period of legends, folk tales, stories about fairies, stories of fairy folk, a lot of interesting things, a lot of interesting customs, and a lot of exciting and interesting things happening in this period. This period has become okay. I already read that. Um, Few historians, Dumville 1977, Snyder 1998, Higheim 2002. Indeed, the limitations of both the historical and archaeological evidence have made it difficult to discuss any person, place, or event in sub Roman Britain with confidence, leaving us with cautious and colorless models that admittedly lack the appeal of Arthurian romance. Historians, it has recently been declared, can as yet say little of value about King Arthur. Historians can, however, say much of value about the 5th and 6th centuries, the period in which either Arthur or his legend was born. To do this, we should eventually discard the label sub Roman, first used by archaeologists to describe 5th century pottery that had degenerated from Roman forms. To say that sub Roman Britain was simply Roman Britain in decay is to overlook both its achievements, monasticism, penitentials, and the continuity with its Roman, Latin education, Mediterranean trade, and Celtic, Latin jewelry, the bardic tradition, past. Assessing the culture of the sub Roman Britons, however, means dealing with three often difficult types of evidence: literary, epigraphic, and archaeological. Written sources. The literary evidence for sub Roman Britain is quite sparse compared to such contemporary societies as Frankish Gaul and the Byzantine East and the Byzantine East. Britain produced only two native writers. They were hardly historians in this period, the clerics Patrick and Gildas, and received few mentions of continental in continental chronicles. The historical narrative for Britain is detailed for the late 4th century, but dwindles after the first decade of the 5th century and remains dark until the Northumbrian scholar Bede began compiling information in for his ecclesiastical history of the English people in the late 7th century. Several writers record barbarian raids which devastated the British provinces in 360 and 367. Ammianus Marcellinus, Ammianus Marcellinus, 21 and 27:8, 382 and 408, Gaelic Chronicle of 452, Gaelic Chronicle of 452. The situation was made worse by the withdrawal of troops from Britain by Magnus Maximus in 483, Stilicho in 402, and Constantine III in 407, all of which were the results of political and military turmoil on the continent. The Roman civil and military administration in Britain took matters in its own hands, electing three successive tyrants: Marcus, Gratian, and Constantine in 406, a traumatic year which ended with barbarians, Alans, Sueves, and Vandals swarming across the frozen Rhine. The last of these British usurpers took the title Constantine III and crossed to Gaul with an army to secure the western frontiers and make good his imperial claims. This Constantine story is ultimately one of betrayal and defeat, ending with his capture at Arles in 411 and subsequent execution, Erosius Adversum Paganos, 742 1 to 4. Interesting events, however, began unfolding in Britain soon after Constantine's departure. The barbarian devastations of 408, in particular the sea-borne raids of Saxons, led the Britons to make a bid for political and military independence from Rome. The following account of these events is from the Byzantine historian Zosimus. The barbarians reduced the inhabitants of Britain and some of the Gaelic peoples to such straits that they revolted from the Roman Empire, no longer submitted to Roman law, and reverted to their native customs. The Britons, therefore, armed themselves and freed their cities from the attacking barbarians. The whole of Armorica and other Gaelic provinces, in imitation of the Britons, freed themselves in the same way, by expelling the Roman magistrates and establishing the government they wanted. Zosimus, New History. This revolution has been variously interpreted as a struggle between pro-Roman and Catholic and pro-Celtic and Pelagian parties. Myries, 1960, Morris, 1965. A class struggle between Bacchidae, a class struggle between Bacchidaea, dissident peasants, and landowners. Thompson, 1977, and Wood, 1984, and a political coup staged by urban elites. Whatever the nature of the revolt, it was officially recognized by the Emperor Honorius, who in 410 sent letters to the cities of Britain giving them permission to fend for themselves. After 410, Rome was no longer able to assert control over Britain. Procopius bellum Vandalicum, and the island came to be ruled by a multitude of Romano-British tyrants. Jerome Epistola, as well as by the Saxon newcomers Gaelic Chronicle of 511. It is impossible to write a narrative history of sub-Roman Britain after 410. The only datable references to Britain in contemporary documents are the recording of 2 visits of Saint Germanus of Auxerre to the island to fight Pelagianism in 429, and Sarka 445, Prosper Chronicon Constantius, Life of Saint Germanus, and a chronicle entry for the year 441 stating that at least a portion of the island has passed into the power of the Saxons. Gaelic Chronicle of 452. The next securely datable event in British history, the next securely datable events in British history begin with St. Augustine's arrival in Kent in 597. For the interim period, historians are forced to deal with a lot of unhistorical material which is devoid of dates and often of personal and place names. For the 5th century, we have the writings of Patrick, a Briton who became the most famous and arguably the most successful Christian missionary in Ireland. And by the way, St. Patrick was not the first missionary, it was St. Palladius who was the first to go to Ireland to evangelize on the island. Patrick was born in a small estate, Velula, owned by his father, Calpurnius, who held both civic and church offices in the nearby town of Banavim Tabornea. Patrick was kidnapped from the estate at the age of 16 and taken to Ireland, where he was sold into slavery. There, desolate and alone, he turned to Christ and experienced a very powerful conversion. 6 years later, he escaped to Britain and underwent ecclesiastical training to become a priest. Later, returning to Ireland as bishop with a missionary zeal to convert his former captors. Patrick left at least 2 writings which, in unpolished Latin and unsophisticated prose, reveals something of both his character and of contemporary Irish and British society. The first is a scathing letter addressed to the soldiers of a British warlord named Caroticus, who was responsible for kidnapping and murdering many of Patrick's new Irish converts. The letter to Caroticus provides personal information about both Patrick and the Briton Caroticus, who Patrick describes as acting like a tyrant. Epistola 6. Patrick's second work, written towards the end of his life, is a spiritual autobiography or confession, in the form made famous by Augustine of Hippo. Though Patrick's sincere personal statement is hardly a masterpiece of theological speculation. Here, Patrick describes the Britain of his youth and the British Church which sponsored but is now having doubts about Patrick's Irish mission. While Britain appears only occasionally in Patrick's writings, it features prominently in those of Gildis, who lived in the early 6th century. Gildis, also a Briton and a member of the clergy, penned a substantial work called The Ruin of Britain, and is thought to have been responsible for a monastic penitential, possibly the first of its kind in the Western Church, which bears his name as well as fragments of some lost letters discussing church matters. The Ruin of Britain begins with an historical prologue, which narrates the foreign and domestic wars plaguing Britain since the departure of the Romans, then turns into an impassioned sermon, a Jeremiad in the true sense of the word, denouncing the crimes of current British rulers and the sins of the British clergy. Though his language and imagery is frequently that of the Old Testament, Gildis occasionally drops clues about Britain's political and ecclesiastical arrangements, and about his own classical Latin education. Lapidge, 1984. Gildis claims that the Scots, and especially the Picts were causing such a serious threat to Britain that a council, concilium, was convened, and its members, together with the proud tyrant, Superbus Tyrannus, elected to hire Saxon mercenaries to defend the eastern portion of the island. The technical military language employed by Gildas likely means that the Britons were following the late Roman practice of hiring barbarian Theodoreti. The Saxons turned against their employers, defeating British forces. The Saxons turned against their employers, defeating British forces and plundering British towns until a Romano-Briton named Ambrosius Aurelianus assumed military leadership. Thereafter, victories were traded by both sides until the siege of Baden Hill, traditionally dated to circa 500 AD, which took place in the year of Gildas's birth. The Britons emerged from Baden victorious, but soon fell into civil war and corruption. Gildas attacks 5 contemporary rulers, variously termed kings and tyrants: Constantine of Dumnonia, Aurelius Caninus, Vortipor of Dalmatia, Cuneglasus, and Maglacunis for swearing false oaths, acting as corrupt judges, and entertaining flatterers and murderers at their courts, not to mention their own sins ranging from adultery to regicide. The British secular clergy are little better. Greed, gluttony, and simony weigh them down, while only the monastics, probably few in Gildas's day, are worthy of praise. Interspersed among these attacks and in Gildas's other writings are more mundane details about diet, dress, and entertainment in 6th century Britain. Gildas and Patrick are 2 most important sources of information for sub-Roman Britain. There are few other sources which, because they were written down later for the most part, must be used cautiously as evidence for the 5th and 6th centuries. A collection of 158 charters recorded in the book of Leon Dav, dealing mostly with land grants in southeast Wales, has been used. W. Davies, 1978, to show the transition of late Roman to early medieval estates. Some of the charters appear to date originally to the 6th century. The earliest British vernacular bardic poetry, such as those verses attributed to Aneurin and Taliesin, is sometimes used to reconstruct heroic society from the late 6th century on. Bede, writing in the 8th century, but drawing on much earlier material, including Gildas, gives us a few additional clues about the sub-Roman period, including the name of a proud tyrant, Vortigern. Another English source, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, composed in Wessex beginning in the 9th century, records Saxon victories over the British and the names of both British and Saxon leaders. which may derive from earlier oral accounts. Two collections of British historical material from the 9th and 10th centuries, the history of the Britons, attributed to the Welsh monk Nennius, and the Welsh annals may likewise draw on some body of Welsh genealogies and saints' lives, the earliest of which is probably the Cornish life of St. Samson, written in the early 7th century. Inscriptions. The literary evidence sometimes provides names for persons and places in sub-Roman Britain, but more often we must deal with the clues present with the political. Regis, tyranny, keves, and ecclesiastical, episcopi, presbytery, monarchy, terminology employed by the writers. These clues are also present in the epigraphic evidence for Roman and sub-Roman Britain. The vast corpus of Roman inscriptions from Britain, mostly in stone, but also occasionally on metal plaques, pottery, and writing tablets, can tell us something of both the public and private life of Britons in the twilight years of the Roman occupation. While much of this evidence comes from the military, i.e., soldiers' tombstones, it tells us something of the religions prevalent in Roman Britain, the ethnic origins of the soldiery, and even what foodstuffs, such as the ever-present cerveza, a Celtic beer, were shipped to the frontier. Oh, by the way, Jean, did you know that a Syrian was stationed in Roman Britain and married a woman from southern Britain in the 3rd century AD? Gene Apologetics, did you know that a Syrian soldier from Palmyra was stationed in Britain and retired there and married a Celtic woman? I thought you would be interested to know that. Take a look at my life in Roman Britain if you're interested. Christianity, of course, became a significant presence in all of the Western provinces by the end of the 4th century. Some Christianized Britons, perhaps inspired by their Gaelic counterparts, began commemorating their dead in the 5th century through inscribed memorial stones. Most of the surviving examples come from Wales. Nash Williams, 1950, and the Southwest. Okasha, 1993, Thomas, 1994. With a few instances in southern towns and in Scotland. These inscriptions are usually in Latin and are occasionally accompanied by the short-lived Irish alphabet known as Ogham, McManus, 1991. The epigraphic evidence from the 5th and 6th centuries has revealed a multitude of personal names, of the famous and of the obscure. Various terms of rule for rulers, rex, protector, magistrate, and clergy, and at least one profession, a medicus. While dating these inscriptions can be difficult, much more can be made of this evidence for early medieval British society than has heretofore been attempted. Archaeology. Finally, we have the archaeology. The material culture of the sub-Roman Britons is increasingly being revealed through the medium of archaeology, at first used merely to supplement the written sources. Archaeological evidence is now often taking center stage in Britain. The maturation of scientific archaeology has even led some true believers to ignore the problematic written sources and treat the 5th and 6th centuries as a prehistoric era, which has freed them to construct new socio political models devoid of names and dates. Arnold, 1984. More common, however, is the archaeological survey, which attempts to answer the questions posed by the written sources and come up with historical or at least quasi historical explanations for the sub Roman period. Esmond Cleary, 1989, Dark, 1993. While Roman urban archaeology has long been pursued enthusiastically in Britain, Dark Age archaeology has been just that, dark. Hence the name of the Dark Ages. But the last 50 years of excavations has shed new light on both the sub-Roman phases of many Roman towns many Roman towns and on rural fortified settlements, hill forts, and monasteries. If not particular in their artificial assemblage, these excavations have revealed impressive structures and the insight that sub Roman Britain was anything but isolated and culturally impoverished. The first and perhaps most important discovery came in the 1930s with Ralph Radford's excavations at Tintagel, Cornwall, Radford, 1939. Beyond the inner ward of Tintagel's Norman castle, Radford uncovered the remains of several small rectangular structures made of stone and slate, as well as thousands of shards of imported Mediterranean pottery, then termed Tintagel ware. Much of the pottery came from wine and oil containers datable to the 5th to 7th centuries, leading Radford to interpret this settlement as a Celtic monastery. Subsequent excavations at Tintagel have revealed more structures and pottery, though alternative interpretations, a princely stronghold, and acting trading post have recently overshadowed the monastic model. Tintagel's impressive commercial activity showed that Britain was not isolated in the sub-Roman period. On the contrary, Britain seems to have opened up new trade relations with Gaul, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean, in which British commodities, most likely tin and slaves, were exchanged for luxury goods. Tintagel ware soon began to be identified from pottery. Finds at other sites and new excavations turned up more examples along with imported glass and jewelry. The defended hilltop settlement at Denaz Powys near Cardiff in Glamorganshire yielded an abundance of these imports, even though its occupation area is quite small compared to Tintagel and the sub-Roman hill forts. Alcock. Leslie Alcock's excavations at Denaz Powys in the 1950s also revealed evidence of a thriving native metalworking industry, perhaps controlled by local rulers who exchanged goods for military services. Alcock also directed the much publicized excavations at South Cadbury, hill fort in the late 1960s. Claimed by Tudor antiquarians to be King Arthur's Camelot, this massive hill fort rises 500 feet above the Somerset Plains. Its steep sides defended by 5 massive ramparts, enclosing a plateau of about 18 acres. South Cadbury revealed a long sequence of activity extending from the Neolithic to late Saxon periods. Extensive fortifications, including stone walls with timber fighting platforms and a sophisticated timber gateway, were made in the 5th century AD, when a large feasting hall dominated the plateau. Once again, excavators found an abundance of imported pottery, along with late Roman coins and Saxon brooches. While the much hoped for clues to the existence of Arthur was not found at South Cadbury, Alcock did reveal a major sub-Roman settlement that was perhaps the residence of a major British ruler. Native hill forts were not the only form of defense for the sub-Roman Britons. Recent excavation along Hadrian's Wall has revealed much 5th and 6th century evidence, including new timber structures built at the wall forts. At Burdo's Wall, for example, timber halls replaced 2 Roman granaries, while at South Shields a new gateway was constructed. Once thought to have been abandoned after 410, it now appears that Hadrian's Wall continued to be used to defend local civilian populations in the sub-Roman period. This may have been the case as well for the Saxon shore forts in the southeast. Both Portchester and Richberith show signs of lingering occupation, while the walls of the latter may have sheltered a Christian church. The strongest evidence, literary, epigraphic, and archaeological, for Christian activity in sub-Roman Britain comes from Whitthorne in southwestern Scotland, claimed by Bede to be the site of St. Ninian's 5th century monastery, Candida Casa. The area has yielded several early Christian memorial stones. Peter Hill's excavations in the 1980s revealed at least 2 phases of early Christian activity at Whitthorne before it was taken by the Vikings. 5th and 6th century features of the site include small rectangular wattle buildings. One structure had lime wash residue, giving credence to Bede's shining house description of Ninian's monastery. A circular oratory, a garden, remains of a moldboard plough, broken wine glasses, and yet more imported pottery. Hill sees good reason to believe that the sub-Roman settlement was indeed a monastery, with a surrounding Christian community large enough to perhaps warrant the provision of a bishop such as Ninian from nearby Carlisle. 4th century ecclesiastical records do provide us with evidence for British bishops associated with towns that were provincial capitals, which means London, Lincoln, York, and possibly Cirencester and Carsal. Most Roman towns in Britain were given major defensive circuits in the late 4th century, making their survival into the 5th century likely. Some historians and archaeologists believe that urban life, if not the towns themselves, was already disappearing by the early 4th century, and thus sub-Roman Britain must have been completely rural. Other scholars have seen signs of continuity between many late Roman towns and their medieval successors. Urban continuity has been argued for Bath, Canterbury, Chester, Chichester, Cirencester, Exeter, Gloucester, Lincoln, London, Winchester, Worcester, and York. At Verulamium, St. Albans, where the medieval town grew up around the Saxon abbey outside of the Roman walls, archaeologists found several 5th century structures and a newly laid water pipe, indicating that a nearby Roman aqueduct was still providing for the town's sub-Roman inhabitants. At Silchester, which did not become a medieval town, excavations revealed that economic activity at the Forum continued into the 5th century, dated by coins and imported pottery and glass, while jewelry and an Ogham inscribed stone hint to 6th century contacts with Irish settlers. The most dynamic urban activity occurred in the city of Roxeter. Philip Barker's meticulous excavations of the Bath's Basilica site revealed the constant repair and reconstruction of a Roman masonry structure into the early 5th century. At that point, a large complex of timber buildings was constructed on the site and lasted until the late 6th century, when they were carefully dismantled. Described by the excavator as the last classically inspired buildings in Britain until the 18th century, this complex included a 2-storied winged house, perhaps with towers, a veranda and a central portico, smaller auxiliary buildings, one of stone, and a strip of covered shops or possibly stables. More a villa than a public building, it was perhaps the residence of a tyrant like Vortigern, who had the resources to build himself a kind of country mansion in the middle of the city, with stables and houses for his retainers. Conclusion: Sub-Roman Roxeter and other archaeological discoveries are helping dispel the myth of the Dark Ages in Britain, while the literary evidence for those years may be sparse. The more we learn about writers like Patrick and Gildas, the more we see that they are connected to the literary tradition stretching across Roman Europe and the Mediterranean, while Latin letters and Christian bishops provide a continuity between sub-Roman Britain and its predecessor. Celtic-style monasticism and art, vernacular bardic poetry, and dynastic tyrant kings look forward to its distinctly medieval future. With or without Arthur, 5th and 6th century Britain developed a more vibrant character than its label, sub-Roman, would imply. And so the sub-Roman period existed from 410 to 597 AD. But now comes the most significant, or perhaps the most important event in 5th century sub-Roman Britain: the arrival of the ancestors of today. The Anglo-Saxon migration, new insights from genetics. Grave goods from inhumation grave 3532 at Issendorf Cemetery. Almost 300 years after the Romans left, scholars like Bede wrote about the Angles and the Saxons and their migrations to the British Isles. Scholars of many disciplines, including archaeology, history, linguists and genetics have debated what his words might have described, and what the scale, the nature, and the impact of human migration were at that time. New genetic results now show that around 75% of the population of eastern and southern England was made up of migrant families whose ancestors must have originated from continental regions bordering the North Sea, including the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. What is more, these families interbred with the existing population of Britain. Most importantly, this migration varied from region to region and community to community. With 278 with 278 ancient genomes from England and hundreds more from Europe, we now gained really fascinating insights into population scale and individual histories during post-Roman times, says Joschka Gritzinger, a lead author of the study. Not only do we now have an idea of the scale of migration, but also how it played out in communities and families. Using published genetic data from more than 4,000 ancient and 10,000 present day Europeans, Gritzinger and colleagues identified subtle genetic differences between the closely related groups inhabiting the ancient North Sea region. Their research appears in Nature. Grave goods from inhumation grave 3532 at Isendorf Cemetery. Eisendorf Cemetery. Migrants intermixed with the local population. Upon arrival, the migrants intermixed with the local population. In one case, in an Anglo-Saxon cemetery from Buckland near Dover, researchers were able to reconstruct a family tree across at least 4 generations and identify the point in time when the migrants and locals intermarried. This family showed a large degree of interaction between the two gene pools. Overall, the researchers witnessed burials of prominent status across the studied cemeteries of both local and migrant origin. The interdisciplinary team, consisting of more than 70 authors, was able to integrate archaeological data with these new genetic results, which revealed that women of immigrant origin were buried with artifacts more often than women of local origin, especially considering items such as brooches and beads. Interestingly, men with weapons were found to have both genetic origin equally often. Men with weapons were found to have both genetic origins equally often. These differences were locally mediated with prominent burials or wealthy graves seen across the range of origins. For example, a woman buried with a complete cow in Cambridgeshire was genetically mixed with majority local ancestry. Duncan Sayer, archaeologist from the University of Central Lancashire and a lead author of the study, says, "We see considerable variation in how this migration affected communities. In some places, we see clear signs of active integration between locals and immigrants, as in the case of Buckland near Dover or Oakington in Cambridgeshire. Yet in other cases, like Apple Down in West Sussex, we see that people with immigrant and local ancestry were buried separately in the cemetery. Perhaps this is evidence of some degree of social separation at this site. Archaeologists excavate grave at 112 at Oakington, Cambridgeshire. Archaeologists excavate a complicated triple burial while working at Oakington, an early Anglo-Saxon grave with pottery vessel, brooches, and a Roman spoon. Impact of this historic migration on present-day English people. With the new data, the team could also consider the impact of this historic migration today. Notably, the present-day English derive only 40% of their DNA from these historic continental ancestors, whereas 20 or 40% of their genetic profile likely came from France or Belgium. This genetic component can be seen in the archaeological individuals and in the graves with Frankish objects found in early medieval graves, particularly in Kent. It remains unclear whether this additional ancestry related to Iron Age France is connected to a few punctuated migration events, such as the Norman conquest, or whether it was the result of centuries-long mobility across the English Channel, says Stephen Scheffels, lead senior author of the study Future Work, specifically targeting the medieval period, and later will reveal the nature of this additional genetic signal. And with that, I'm finished. And so, that was life in the Germanic barbarian kingdoms, or Teutonic, whichever you wish to prefer. It is entirely up to you. So, most of the royal and noble families of Europe, such as the British and German royals, and for that matter, some of the French and Russian royals, all go back to Viking chieftains. They trace their family and noble lineages back to Viking chieftains or to some barbarian kings of late antiquity. Most of the European royal families trace direct lineages back to Charlemagne, the Carolingian emperor of the Franks. So this period is known as the Dark Ages. It ends in 800 AD when the Pope crowns Charlemagne the Emperor of the Romans. But even then, Vikings were raiding and ransacking monasteries from Scotland and from the Hebrides Islands all the way down into Gaul, all the way down into Al-Andalus, Spain. Yes, Vikings actually raided Islamic Spain. And of course, they also went into Russia. So anyways, I will talk about that in a later presentation. Next time, I will talk about life in Anglo-Saxon times. So I will take a look now at the chat. KSI Sniper says, Forge Gang! I am a hard man. Yeah, dude. This guy, I don't know. Is this guy one of Euros's alts? I've been having some of Euros MC's fake alts come in here and start up shit. What is up, third for the second? Hello, good sir. Would you rather be German or Celtic? I don't even see how that would be a choice, because you're talking about tribes from classical antiquity and kingdoms and like baronies of the early Middle Ages. And it's like, I don't know what you mean exactly. Rick Perry says, Forge Gang! I am a hard man! Rick Perry pulls a joystick with his hand. Rick Perry posts an emoji of a hand pushing some stick or some motion. Cameron Bushkirk. Considering the outcome, probably a German, LOL. Are you referring to Third for the Second's earlier comment? Well, I mean, my surname is German. My surname is from Germany. But it comes from the Rhineland, which was highly mixed between Gauls or Gallo-Romans and Franks. But I'm not going to get into that. That has nothing to do with this presentation. What's up, Gene? Gene says, skid it. Let's go. Gene says that I am partial to the Celts, but I'd prefer to be a Celt in the British Isles and not in Spain and Germany. A lot of the folk music and a lot of the bardic traditions and the bardic tales derive from the Celts and from medieval Celtic prose and poetry. James says, very interesting, Palmyra is an exquisite Roman ruin in the desert. See my life in Roman Britain and skip ahead like to about maybe 20 or 15 minutes, and I think I talk about it. Okay, and you are... You're banned. All right. MK Ultra Fondler, you're banned. All right. I guess that's it. So, yeah. The bottom thing that I want to talk about is that the main thing that I want to talk about, or the main thing to take away from this is the beginning of medieval Christendom, as well as the beginning of Europe. Europe has an entity, or Europe has this corporeal conception, did not begin in ancient times. This is a creation of the Middle Ages, and it is a creation of the Christian Church. The Christian Church is the only institution from the Roman period to survive the Dark Ages. And it is virtually the only institution from before to actually collaborate with the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons and the Ostrogoths and Visigoths, etc., and the Irish, in basically building monasteries and reviving culture and learning. Charlemagne was very interested in acquiring knowledge and having libraries and stuff in his monasteries and reviving learning and culture. So, again, this is the time period when Europe and England, the nation and the people of England and Germany and France begin to be born. The countries, the nations of Europe, the identity of Europe, the very conception of a European is born in this period. The Greeks and the Romans had nothing to do with the creation of Europe. They were a Mediterranean culture. They were a Mediterranean people. The Germanics and the Celts were a Central and Northern European people, and the mixture of these cultures, this vernacular Latin culture, this Romanic culture, and these Celtic and Germanic, but more so Germanic cultures, is what created modern Europe. This is how the modern European identity actually began. It is out of this culture and out of this civilization that the modern world as we know it today began. Of course, it had its precedence in the classical world, in Greece, and there's no doubt that Hellas was the birth of Europe. But there are transitions that take place. The Dark Ages are the beginning of Europe. It is the Dark Ages and the medieval period that the feudal church and the feudal civilization in which European identity is bred out of. So it's very significant and quite important to consider. Now, one more thing to go off on, because I've been doing this for almost 3 hours. Hopefully there wasn't a lot of interruptions, because I had to turn on the air conditioner and it got so hot. I was sweating. I had to run the air conditioner, and it might have filtered out some of what I was saying in the earlier part of the stream, which I hope it did not do, because I don't want to do this again. But anyways, most of these barbarian successor states don't exist anymore, but at least the Franks and the Saxons, they survived into becoming the nations of England and France. In the case of Germany, it's a bit more complicated, because the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation was fragmented and fractured into like 700 different small units. And this was a feature that lasted until the beginning of the 19th century, when Napoleon restructured the Germanies. So Germany kind of got its start significantly differently from France and Great Britain. Anyways, thank you all for watching. Have a good day. Forge gang! I am still a hard man. Stay hard and proud.